Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Coffee Barometer. My name is Toby Webb. I'm the founder of Innovation Forum, and I and my team have been supporting the folk at Solidaridad and Conservation International and others to set this event up. It's very much their event. We're just here to help with some of the logistics and moderating this next 90 minutes or so. In the usual way on Zoom, we're waiting for participants to come in and join us. So I'm not going to do too many introductions or beginnings till we're clear as to exactly how many people are going to show up in the next minute or two. I'm sure you're all here because you're either coffee professionals or you have a great interest in coffee. Maybe it's part of your portfolio. It's clearly one of the key products that is feeling the heat of climate change and other changes in the world going on today, not least commercial and other. But we're here today to talk about the findings of the Coffee Barometer, and we're very much looking forward to some robust discussions with time for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, you're welcome to use the chat function to ask it. But the shorter and more focused your question is, the more likely it is that we'll be able to get to it. We do occasionally get people writing very long essays in a very small chat window. And if you like to, if you enjoy doing that personally, well, please do go ahead, but we may not be able to address it. So just bear in mind, comments in the Q&A section should be fairly short and sweet, to use the English term. We do also have translation here as well for those of you joining us as Spanish speakers. You prefer to view this with the interpretation of the Spanish channel. You should be able to do that using the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. So just briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with Innovation Forum, we are a 10-year-old company. And before that, those of us who set it up have been working in sustainability for a long time. And our job is really as kind of brokers. We connect people, we do conferences, we do research, we do launches like this, and we really help organizations, companies connect with others in Zoom, but preferably face-to-face. And if you want to join us for one of our events, we have a big one coming up, which is our Sustainable Landscapes and Commodities Conference, which is in Amsterdam on the 31st of October, 1st of November. And that kind of does what it says, really. It's 400 people talking, executives talking about sustainable commodities and landscapes, and always a fascinating event. So you're very welcome to join us face-to-face, but we're not here to talk much more about Innovation Forum. We're here to talk about the Coffee Barometer. And this has just been launched in its current iteration, written by Ethos Agriculture with the support of Conservation International and Solidaridad. I think the headlines around it are that it's supporting the prediction that rising temperatures could drastically reduce the amount of land suitable for growing coffee by 2050. So given how long it takes to grow good coffee, we're all aware of the challenges of agricultural development. We need to get started now on tackling climate change, as I'm sure we're all aware. It also notes that there are challenges around deforestation and, of course, livelihoods. The people factor is huge. So we're going to hear more about the contents of the barometer from those intimately familiar with it. And then we're going to hear about some of the drivers for the supply side of coffee sustainability in a kind of interactive Q&A session. Following that, we're going to talk about the demand side, and of course, innovation and opportunity. It's very easy to sit on Zoom or in a conference room or in a meeting and talk on and on about all the problems and isn't everything terrible and what are we going to do about it? Well, we need to focus on what we're going to do about it and how to be practical. And that's where the innovation and opportunity angle comes in. As I'm sure you're all aware, if you want business people to do something about a problem, you've got to make it about opportunity and innovation to achieve that opportunity, because sort of compliance only gets us so far. So we're looking forward to discussing how we can turn these significant challenges into innovation, into opportunity using innovation. We're going to have a little vote or a poll a bit later. That'll be exciting. And of course, we've got a Q&A session built in at the end, towards the end of our 90 minutes. So your views can be heard as long as they are succinct and clear. That would be very helpful. So that's the order of play. I hope everyone is clear about that. To start off with, let's actually find out, well, what's in the barometer. Many of you perhaps won't have had time to read it yet. Some of you will. Some of you may be outraged by it. Some of you may be inspired by it. Let's hear about some of the key messages that Ethos Agriculture have uncovered that they want to tell you about now, and you'll have to get the rest by reading the report yourself. So very much looking forward to introducing Sjoerd Panhuysen, who's from Ethos Agriculture, who are the authors of the report. And in this part, we are going to talk about the key elements of the new edition, what's different from before, what are the headlines, and we're going to have a brief presentation, very short, about that from Sjoerd, and then we're going to talk about perhaps some of the challenges and some of the technicalities of it. So, Sjoerd, thanks for joining us. Perhaps over to you to tell us a bit about what you've uncovered for this iteration of the barometer.
Sure, thanks a lot. Well, actually, this is already the 7th edition of the barometer. We started in 2006, and every 2-3 years we create an update. And actually, I'm very happy today that we also will present something completely new, which we will get back to later. But maybe, yeah, starting with like what are the primary challenges that we do see in the coffee sector. And probably I'm not saying that many new things, but it's important to keep in mind the combination of these challenges, because from the outside, it looks like the sector is really thriving and coffee consumption has been growing every year with 1 or 2% at the global scale. Coffee is everybody loves the product and likes to talk also about coffee, and I think that's what I really like about this sector, that it's so close to everybody's daily interaction with food and drinks. And what we also see is an increasing coffee price in recent years. So from that perspective, it looks quite rosy. However, what we do see is also a concentration in the market, and especially if we look where does the coffee come from that we consume, it's mostly around 40% in these days comes from Brazil, 20% from Vietnam, and then there are only 3 countries, including Colombia, Indonesia, Honduras, that produce like 15%. And we know that there are more than 50 countries in the world that are producing coffee. And then the question indeed becomes, okay, all these countries producing coffee and only exporting, or they are only, from the total amount, they're only exporting 15%, or 15 to 25%, what's actually going on in these countries. The issue that we encounter, and we can move to the first slide, is probably that the image of coffee in a lot of countries is becoming the image of a poverty crop. What we do see is that coffee actually does not contribute sufficiently these days to the household income of farmers. And it's not 1 or 2 or 3 countries, but over all the picture, it's not looking very good. If we in this figure, you can see that only in Brazil, farmers are actually able to earn a living income from coffee, while all the other farming households are not getting even close to living income from coffee. Of course, we know a smart farmer will have a very diversified income stream, but if coffee is an important part of that income stream, it also has to be profitable, and that is really questionable these days. Next to that, what we also see, and what you already started with, is the question around the influence of climate change. That's not something of today, it's not something of the future, it's something that has been going on for the last at least 20 years, where we hear about a lot of impacts of climate change in all the main producing countries and all the other producing countries too. Maybe we can go to the next slide just to illustrate this point. Is what we see is often linked to the income part, is that the discussions in coffee tend to go around. We have great examples of Brazil and Vietnam producing highly efficiently in sun-grown high input systems. The reality is that we will have to move to more like agroforestry and regenerative agricultural systems, which really ask a complete change of mindset in the coffee sector, and also a lot of investment to really adapt to climate change, because the future of coffee is probably not going to be sun-grown coffee, but will move more and more actually back to its original way of growing in shade. So that's a huge challenge for the sector, and it's also going to be very costly and indeed time consuming. Maybe we can move to the next question.
Sure. I was interested to find out about the Coffee Brew Index.
Sure.
Tell us more about that.
Yes, indeed. So that's the next slide. Actually, that's what I was announcing. We wanted to do something new with this coffee barometer, and this time what we did, we actually thought all the barometers are about what is the private sector saying they are doing, and what actually do we say that they do. But maybe it's time to really go into the nitty-gritty details of their policies and strategies around what actually is their vision going for a more sustainable sector. So we came up with the Coffee Brew Index, and what we do is we actually look at the top 11 roasting companies in the world. They are responsible for more than 1/3 of roasting green coffees, and well, most consumers will be very familiar with any of their brands. So we thought that's a great starting point. Let's look at these companies. What are their strategies? What are their investments? Do they share this in a measurable and transparent way? And as you might notice from this picture, there's a lot to say about these companies and their strategies. Some are doing quite well and come with comprehensive strategy, comprehensive way of reporting, while other companies seem still to lag behind and still think that they can get away with just doing their business as usual and not really sharing any ideas or strategy or policy and practice with the public. Because what we did, we really focused on what data is actually publicly available, and what are the sources that these companies are sharing with the public. So if we go into a bit more detail, the next slide, please, because of course sustainability is a broad subject, a broad container. If we break it down, what we did, we looked at the social, the environmental, and the economic part. If we look at the social part, the disclosure on what we call human rights related issues, and what we do see in at least half of the reports is that the narratives are not they are not general, they are case specific. They are often just citing examples. Sometimes they touch upon labor rights, other time they will spotlight a gender equality project, or maybe a youth and a next generation activity that's ongoing. But what we miss is really on the human rights issues, is that all of the reports fail to really describe change over time. And of course, that should be a starting point if you report what actually is changing, and not just come up with interesting examples, but that do not really cover the whole picture. If we go to the next slide, we can look at what are these companies doing on environmental and climate related issues. I think the good thing is, compared to a few years ago, we noticed a real improvement in reporting, at least towards the climate related targets. Especially the 5 companies that you see here on top, they manage, or they really report and try to manage the climate risks, and that also comes through in their in the activities that they describe on climate adaptation programs and projects. However, what we also see is another important issue with this, which is hotly debated currently, are all the zero deforestation targets. They somehow, in a lot of the other reports, these are missing, and a good practice would be to have cutoff dates. In a lot of reports, we couldn't find any details about that. And what we also see a lot in this related to the environment is that a lot of the responsibility is clearly pushed down towards the suppliers and the traders. And we think it's really something the companies themselves have to take responsibility for.
Thank you. Let me just ask you a couple of questions there to build on that. Firstly, what companies often say when they get sort of ranked in this sort of way is, oh, these NGOs, they don't understand our business. There's something's been taken out of context. A bit of data was missing, and that's given us a bad score. We've all heard that story a number of times. Just so that we're clear for those who haven't been involved in the, the setting up of your criteria, and then on the other end of
Sure.
the question, do you make your criteria clear and public for the company so they can see what you're expecting from them? I mean, whether or not they choose to perform on that is a different matter, of course. But what sort of level of transparency do you offer for those in here about your methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good point. We've tried to keep our methodology relatively simple and to the point, and it's all available on our new website, which is at coffeebarometer.org, where you also will find a brief company profile, where we also give a bit of background around the reporting, where we will have links to all the public commitments and reports that are available. And next to that, we also do provide the detailed background, like the scoring, the methodology. So if you really want to go into the details, please visit our website, because you will be you can find all those.
Okay. And then what are the implications of this then? I mean, we're seeing the same names with the green aroma across these different issues. So, I mean, one of the patterns that's emerging here is that, for example, in the opinion of the barometer, Nestle and Lavazza are doing pretty well compared to Kraft Heinz and Strauss. I mean, that looks pretty obvious across, in your assessment, that is, across these. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what are the implications of this? Should these other companies be looking at what Nestle and Lavazza are doing and saying, "Oh, let's do more of that," or is there a more complex set of implications?
Oh, it's probably a little bit more complex than what meets the eye currently. Maybe therefore we can just also briefly look at the last slide, or the last slide of the index, because if we start to look at the economic conditions, the purchasing policies of companies that often seem not very well aligned with their sustainability targets, we do see a different picture. We do see most companies are not really performing or on paper at least, are not performing at the level that we expect them, and that there's a lot of room for improvement for all these companies to really figure out how to link their sustainability goals with their procurement practices. For example, we looked at do companies really have an idea or policy or practices around how to improve farm profitability, how to address the cost of production, how to deal with the discussions around living income. Do they have any plans to pay more for the coffee? But we couldn't find any of this information in the current reports. What often happens is that companies refer us to the fact that they are part of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are dealing with these more difficult issues. But of course, that if at the individual company level that responsibility is not taken, then it won't be translated in any collective effort either.
And what's your understanding of how the company's approaches to these issues is evolving? I mean, are you in constant dialogue or regular dialogue with those who score well, and then have no dialogue at all with the ones who score badly? I mean, that's a very simple question, but is there any kind of ongoing mechanism of discussion you have with the companies about why some are doing better than others?
Sure. Of course, this is the first time that we present this more in-depth look at the strategies of companies. And of course, we know that the challenges are very complex that these companies are dealing with, but we also want companies to realize that individually they are probably not going to change climate change, or they are not going to change living income. But there's so much knowledge already in the sector. There's so many good examples that do exist, and more interaction at this level is really necessary. Actually, we are in contact with 10 of the 11 companies on this list, and I would say we are very appreciative of all the companies that have been going back and forth with our interpretation of their data. And I think a lot of companies also acknowledge that there is a lot of room for improvement. What we really want to see is also, okay, if you acknowledge this room for improvement, you also have to, for example, what none of the companies share with us is how much do you actually invest in trying to make your supply chain more sustainable? And that's just, it sounds like a simple example, but probably the devil here is also in the details, because it's all good to have also for the companies that look better on paper to have this great policies and practices, but in the end, of course, it's about, okay, how does it work in practice? And that is immediately what I will say here. That's also the limitation of our research. We did not look how all these policies are translated into activities, into practice. And I think it's also something that is not available in the public domain either. So that's something that we as a sector really have to work on.
Okay. And obviously you've been looking at these companies for a while in different iterations of the barometer. What do you notice that they have more in common that they didn't in the past? You know, because we can all remember the days of CSR of 15, 20 years ago. Companies would cherry pick stories, and one company's story could be quite different from another one. And now, of course, we do have a lot more consistency around key benchmarks, you know, carbon emissions, living income, etc. But are you seeing more commonalities emerging? I mean, the one I'm thinking about, of course, is regenerative agriculture, you know, which we work with Nestle a lot to help them engage on that. And, you know, they seem very, very keen to collaborate with everybody else on regen, particularly on the pilots that they're doing. So that's just an example. Do you see any particular themes that the companies have more in common than in the past?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's also what we acknowledge, that the depth of the discussion around sustainability has really improved over the years, and really also touching on very difficult issues. And I think one of the recent examples is, of course, all discussions around living income, but the other commonality that we do see, and what we also show here, is there's still this reluctance within the sector to actually pay for the social and environmental costs that are linked to the production of coffee. And I think that is the major issue that the sector really has to deal with, and probably acknowledge and realize that the era of cheap coffee might be over, and that it's really now about, okay, we really need to create a sustainable product. And it's not only about the intrinsic quality of coffee, it's broader now. It's also about human rights, it's about the environment, it's about the future of farming. So
is it simplistic of me to suggest that the companies who score better are simply investing more money, and that could be across people, external support, consultancies, multi-stakeholder groups, and economic contributions? I mean, is it as simple as that? The money talks, but I mean, I know it's not really, is it? Because you got other issues there. But what are your views?
I think indeed that could be a conclusion. I think the other conclusion is it's still the scale of these companies, the level of how good are they in communicating their ideas and plans and linking up with other parties to address certain aspects of sustainability. Some companies are more advanced than others in this field, and that's very clear. But I don't think that any of the companies on our list could hide behind like a story like, we don't know who our farmers are, we cannot invest that much money in our supply chain to support farmers, because in the end, left or right, they are very dependent of farmers, and also of actually a coffee sector that is diverse and thriving. And to have that type of sector, you really need to keep on supporting the complete sector, not only focus, for example, on sourcing your coffee from Brazil or Vietnam.
Okay, thank you. Sure, that was really helpful, really interesting. Take a few minutes, have a look at the Q&A. There's some really interesting questions coming in. I'm going to ask you to address at least a couple of them later. In the meantime, let's move on and talk a bit about the drivers for sustainability on the supply side. Really, we're talking about origin here. So we're going to hear from Vera, Espíndola, Rafael from KUANU Consulting and Azahar Coffee, and Andrea, Olivar from Solidaridad. And we're going to discuss some issues here around diversity of farmers and smallholders. And we're going to do it in a kind of Q&A format so that we keep it interesting, keep it moving. So Vera, welcome. I know you've got up very early to join us, so thank you for having your coffee a bit earlier this morning, so that we can have this conversation. Give us the kind of one sentence on what you do, just for those who aren't familiar, because I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with Solidaridad, but just for your work, just give us that one sentence on what you do.
Well, you make it difficult because you said your one sentence. I work primarily on, I think the title says it's strategic initiatives throughout the coffee sector. So primarily I work with the Azahar Coffee Company. They're an export company based in Mexico and Colombia. And I also have my own consultancy where I support support companies, organizations on research or other elements they're looking for.
Okay, great, excellent. Thank you. That's just helpful for those who aren't familiar with your work. So if we argue that the efficiency of interventions is limited by treating smallholder products as a homogeneous group, which can ignore geographical, social, and industry differences between farmers, how do we talk about some examples of the issues here? Because there's some really challenging ways of looking at this. So I'm just interested in your views on that first point.
Yeah, I mean, defining interventions for different type of smallholders is indeed a very hard task. I simply think that when defining these interventions and making or thinking that they are relevant for all smallholders makes it very simplistic in a sense. I think in ignoring these unique characteristics is simply oversimplifying issues at hand that are defined by socioeconomic, geographical conditions. Again, I mean, it's true that it's hard to take every scenario into consideration. I think defining that one unique recipe that always can work as if you're making every single time an apple pie doesn't, end up being the same apple pie, so to say. I think generally what is one of the issues that in part leads to this is simply a disconnection and understanding of what it really means to be a smallholder supplying a product as coffee to an international supply chain. We think we know, we often talk that we know, and we often post pictures even of trips of producing countries. But what do we really know then? And what we do now know is that there is an imbalance in the value distribution of coffee and awarding X amount of value to the majority of farmers to, at minimum, cover their costs plus margin. And what we have created in the meantime are these interventions that overcome, or that we try to overcome these barriers to, for example, with standards, norms, loans, credit schemes, and other development work. And what we cannot overlook is that the majority of coffee producers are still at a level of poverty. And I often hear that this is because the producer is not able to produce more. The producer needs to be more sustainable, more efficient, produce more quality, because that's why they are where they are, which is poor. And these interventions are often created and imposed on them versus including them in the dialogue. And mind you, including them is a hard process and perhaps an even more slower one than where we are, but perhaps also a route we have to consider because at the end of the day, we have to consider their views as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And thinking back to a recent event we did with Nestle on regen in coffee, speaking to one of their farmers in Honduras versus one of the farmers in Vietnam, it's almost like another world, literally another world, in terms of the differences in how they operate and the pressures that they're under. Intensive farming in Vietnam with Robusto, very different from shade-grown Arabica in Central America. And those kind of targeted interventions seem to be the right way to go. And in order to do that, of course, we need to know what we're classifying as where. So, Andrea, why don't you talk us through a bit about that? Can we do this better in terms of knowing how we can plan for better interventions in specific places, and particularly, obviously, taking into account the needs of farmers as well as our own climate targets or whatever they happen to be from the sourcing company? Andrea.
Hi, Toby. Yeah, I think we can. I think one of the key issues in the barometer is that we're trying to put in the messages to say, look, producers are different, and perhaps ideally we get to the point that Vera is saying about having a conversation with them and going at that level. But let's start from what we know. The assumption is everyone is the same, and we go along and we have some sustainability strategies and we have this silver bullet that we hope that it works for everyone. And I think the classification, you can do a classification and you can start to have some specific steps. And I think I have identified 3 things that seem basic, but everyone can start to do. They seem simple, but they are not. And I think the first one is, let's start by the classification of what type of producers you're sourcing from at country level. And I think Sjoerd said that, and we might have a slide for that, where we seen that there had been coffees produced by 50 countries in the world. And we can see, thank you, this sounds is quite good. 50 producers in the world, but 5 of them are producing 85% volumes. And the remaining 15% is contributing to 45. So this is important because the approach that you have for those countries that are producing 85% of volumes to those countries that have and are producing 15% of volume has to be different. So it sounds, it's at top level, but this often doesn't happen. So first classification, important to take into account the contribution to global coffee volumes. I think the second part that is quite important is after you have identified that, and if you're dealing with a Colombia or if you're dealing with a Honduras or with a Ethiopia, then the key point here is to try to, again, get away from those national average where we hope that that single solution that Vera was mentioning will work. But let's try to start to look at producers' archetypes. And producers' archetypes are not perfect either. You can do this by production, you can do this by size of the farm, but at least it doesn't give you one single profile of a producer in Brazil or in Colombia, in Honduras, in Ethiopia or Vietnam. It starts to allow you to have a breakdown of which type of producers you have. And if a supply chain partner is able to do that, if a supply manager is able to do that, then they will have an insight of the fabric of producers that they're working on. And they start to say, okay, perhaps for these producers, we can have a solution and so on, which is the third point, which is after you have your country of which type of country you are sourcing coffee from, which type of archetype of producer you're working with within that country, and then you can start to develop the interventions that you want to do per archetype. And I think this is important, and we have seen it in different contexts, and even in other sectors I have seen it, because it's the very different intervention that you will need, for instance, with a producer that is very close to the ideal productivity level, a relatively good income, to one that is not there. So in the first one, you perhaps have a small, quick intervention that enables them to move upwards, and that's great. But with the other one, you will need an initiative that is more thought through, it needs more research, it is more thorough. So you need to do those classifications. And it sounds simple, those 3 steps, but what we've seen is that many supply chain actors are not at this level because they don't know where the coffee is coming from. They have a vague idea of a Brazil level or so on, but they are not able at the moment to have that conversation that Vera was talking about.
Okay, so traceability is absolutely key here. And one of the many drivers for increased traceability is, of course, the EU regulation for deforestation. And I note that the barometer claims, and I know it does say roughly as a disclaimer, 130,000 hectares in the last 20 years has been deforested for coffee expansion. And of course, it's difficult to work out a precise number here. I think it's certainly clear from mapping technology and ground truthing that it's happening, and if that's correct, that's a lot of land conversion. So we now see the EU regulation for deforestation, which is causing major consternation in across businesses trying to work out how they can comply with it and what it means. So Vera, can we talk about that? What companies always think about is, what's it going to do to their margins and their sourcing policy and mass balance and that kind of stuff. But for farmers, what do you think the impact's going to be?
That's a very big question. I know several producing countries have put mechanisms in place for years, either through legislations or either to public policy. Even the development work has, focused on mitigating, adapting, and also, these legislations or interventions to combat deforestation have also to do with making sure that these practices do not occur, as well as monitoring the same intervention at country level. I think, unfortunately, the tools at hand to prove that it does comply are still sometimes debated. And what is most concerning, I think, is that the majority of the smallholders are unaware of this new legislation, which is, understandable since it's just started. It has just been taken into force. But I think that even at a country level, certain practices that come into place and certain practices that need to be done are often very much without that smallholder inclusion, because that's one of the hardest things to do, right? But I want to redirect my answer more into the following, which I was reminded by a friend of mine recently, that she said to me, legislation is to empower the unprivileged. And I'm unsure if we have achieved in doing so when analyzing these new rules of the game. Will smallholders obtain more knowledge? Will smallholders understand why they have to do certain things now? Will they now know where their coffee goes to? And will they now have even more bargaining power? We're again thinking from a mindset, what I consume needs to comply with X, right? Or my company needs to assure X. And for me, that is, a not inclusive mindset. And what I see is that perhaps this can again lead to one part of the supply chain with having more information, more data, more decision power. And for now, I worry that the outcome will disadvantage smallholders in particular. And with that in mind, I do think that we must listen to producing countries, to producing communities, and co-create interventions with them, not for them.
Thank you. And I think, to be fair to the European Commission, at our conferences and meetings we've been holding, they are in attendance and they sit and they listen intently. And they have said, we are willing and keen to look at this, because for a lot of the kind of politicians or the lawmakers or the implementers, causing poverty of smallholders is the last thing they want to do. But we're all aware, of course, that unintended consequences can happen all the time. So it's going to be interesting to see also how the policy shifts should these consequences become obvious. And Andrea, what are your views on perhaps beyond just smallholders, on how the EUDR, as we're abbreviating it, what difference will it make to the sourcing trends of companies that you see? What are your predictions, Andrea?
I'm trying to see the future, but I think it really depends if the sector see the regulation as an opportunity, and that's the angle they take, or if they see and manage it as a risk. So if you see it as an opportunity, I think the trend will be, as you mentioned, Toby, more transparency, more traceability, and possibly we will start to see some supply chain actors starting to develop mechanisms, for instance, to try to compensate or to incentivize producers that are able to maintain their productivity, meaning continue to supply those volumes, and also to protect the forests that they have in their farms or in the neighboring areas. So that's, if it's an opportunity, that is probably the trend. And the trend then will be that those 130,000 hectares that we mentioned in the barometer are likely to be reduced in the next 5 years. So if we see that, and let's say that's the opportunity side. But if the sector thinks, you know what, we need to manage this from the risk point of view, and we want to have a low risk angle to it, then I think the picture will be quite different. First of all, what will happen, I think, is that those buyers will try to prioritize those origins that are deforestation free by default. And what does that mean? Basically, if you clear your land to produce the coffee that you have today before December 2020, then you are deforestation free, and you don't need to open any more land, then you are deforestation free by default. And we're starting to see some reports from Brazil, 98% of Minas Gerais will be deforestation free, similar things for Colombia, so on and so forth. So those countries that are already deforested, they will be prioritized by supply chain actors if you have a low risk approach. But then the issue is that then we will put in the problem to decide for the time being, because you will start to develop a system for those producers that are low risk in deforestation. And those producers that actually have the problem will be kind of left for a second phase, or let's ignore them, or let's exclude them from the market, which is quite dramatic, I think. So it is very likely that if we have the low risk approach, then those producers will be excluded from sending their coffee to the EU. That coffee will make their way to another market, perhaps that had less rigid or more flexibility to enter a specific zone. But what it means is that in 5 years, we're very unlikely to do any changes in the deforestation rate. Why? Because you're working with the producers that have no problems. So we will hopefully, as a sector, we know that we're not the worst sector that is contributing to deforestation, which is great, but equally we have a responsibility. So I'm really hoping that the coffee sector thinks this is an opportunity for us, and let's try to find, let's continue to work with those producers that are low risk, and we can develop systems there, but let's not ignore where the problem is at the moment, because we will lose 5 years. And the issue with losing 5 years is that many of the companies have net deforestation targets that were originally 2025, 30, they're moving forward. You will lose 5 years to get there. So hopefully we will have this approach of and seeing the legislation as an opportunity and not at a low risk approach.
There are those in the palm oil sector who point out that, you know, deforestation in Indonesia is down 85% on a 10-year timescale from oil palm, and that's seen as a really big win. You know, one of the few positive stats you read about palm oil, which of course has been largely demonized by the media. And I guess what you're suggesting is the coffee industry needs to look for that kind of opportunity to tell its story better about progress.
Yeah, indeed. And I think Indonesia is an example that shows it can be done. You know, it's not impossible. It can be done. It's more complex in terms of supply chain. So we know it can be done, but then we have to see how do we going to approach it. And then hopefully, and this is another risk that we see, and then I hope it doesn't materialize, is that hopefully the sustainability investments that are happening at farm level today won't be used to pay for a compliance system, because that again will let us in a space and will limit progress in the long term. So these things need to be done. System had to be put in place, but also there is an opportunity for us to see the example of palm oil and see, okay, this is possible. Or even Brazil as a country, before Bolsonaro, we could have a space where reforestation rates can dramatically go lower.
Thank you. Yes. And I think the landscape approach kind of gives us all hope that actually we can learn and work across commodities, because as mentioned at the very top of the webinar, you know, a smart farmer grows a number of different crops. So it makes a lot of sense if we can start joining up various other commodities and crops to learn from them, because the farmers are farming them multiply in different landscapes, which can be lined up and compensated. So there's a lot of interesting work starting to happen there. We're going to park this panel just for now. If you have questions and comments, put them in to the Q&A. You can see what's happening there. There's a very good debate going on. Let's talk about the demand side now. Niels Haak is here from Conservation International, and Liesl Truscott from the Biodiversity Consultancy. And of course, Liesl, you have long experience in the textile sector, the cotton sector, which has some interesting parallels and much to learn from your experience. So Niels, why don't we start off with you? We're going to talk about the kind of readiness of the industry for this, the impact the rankings have had, similar rankings have had in other sectors. I'm just really interested to hear from you both around that sort of shift from voluntary to mandatory due diligence, the role of multi-stakeholder partnerships. So there's lots to talk about here. Let's be kind of specific to start with. In fact, Liesl, I'll come to you first. The barometer talks about the shift from voluntary to mandatory sustainability measures. Do you think this sort of shift raises the bar and leads to more impact? I mean, we could certainly argue that consistency is quite helpful to drive comparability. But what are your views, Liesl?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. No, it's a really good question and fascinating conversation so far, I must say. And can see a lot of parallels with smallholders in fashion and textiles, of course, as we can with other products. So that's great to see this barometer raising that awareness and those discussions, and looking at one commodity, but many can learn from it. I guess on the question of mandatory versus voluntary, and your point about raising the bar and leading to impact, Toby, I think for sure raising the bar is a role of mandatory measures, and I think we really need more of that, and I think that's a general consensus that we're seeing. So just last year, I think there were over 400 companies that pushed for mandatory reporting of nature-based risk and dependencies. So that's coming from corporates to push that sort of mandatory disclosure and transparency. And what that will hopefully have a knock-on for is that it will rise up the risk register within companies. They will mobilize around this, opportunity, or around this risk that, companies can then hopefully turn into innovation, creativity that you talked about before, Toby. So it's not a race to the bottom in terms of compliance, but more about kickstarting more of that innovation that we need. And I've been a big advocate of, business-led, industry-led activity, that sort of race to the top. And I will talk a bit more about benchmarking later, but I think there's definitely a place for that. We really need the fast movers, the companies with these sort of values deep in their DNA, as they say, to that advocacy that they can give, that leadership, that solution finding, and hopefully more and more of that sort of sharing of opportunity. So it's not about a competitive race to the top, but it's more about we've all got to get there together. But I think, to your point, we need the regulation, because we need everybody to be moving along a lot more quickly than they are. And what we also need is more of those enabling factors. It's a systems change that we're looking at. Mandatory regulations, as we've just been discussing, won't be a single bullet solution. It will need to enable a lot more creativity in the support services and the supply chains, and of course in the financial services as well, which I think that gets really exciting.
Thank you. Lots more to talk about on that. Niels, let me turn to you. The barometer says that companies are not ready for the EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulation. Why not? And also, what do you mean by not ready, Niels?
Thanks, Toby. And fully agree with a lot of the points that Liesl just mentioned in terms of that snowball effect that we're seeing and hoping to get in terms of that race to the top and that level playing field. In terms of the EUDR, I'd probably say that we state the obvious when we come to the conclusion that coffee companies are not prepared. And time is running. Companies have basically more than a year to get ready, and the requirements of the EUDR are quite demanding. Let's be clear about that, to comply, especially in terms of traceability. And then it also doesn't necessarily help that some of the technical questions on how it's being implemented are still unclear. And we need a lot of information from the EU authorities on that. However, I think what is very important, and Liesl alluded to some of the business advocacy and the business calling for action that we've seen in other sectors, we've seen lacking in coffee over the last years. I'm pretty pleased that in this session today, the topic of deforestation is top of the agenda, front of center, but it's taken us to get to an EUDR to get the topic of the EU deforestation so high on the agenda. Basically, I think EUDR, the writings of the legislation were on the wall for many, many years. In Brussels, industry groups and NGOs and policymakers and other sectors have been in dialogue for this topic of imported deforestation for nearly a decade. And the coffee industry has only started to engage in the last couple of years, when actually the ink was already drying on the on the legislation, and that's a massive missed opportunity in terms of that readiness. And I think that is one of the concerning points, and in terms of what is this going to mean in terms of the implementation and the burden on smallholders. So the industry needs to play a little bit of catch up now in terms of getting ready and rushing to set up all the internal mechanisms within their companies for compliance. And it's really crucial that in doing so, that that burden again is not put on the smallholders, but it is actually leading to exploring opportunities for collaboration across the sector.
Thank you. I guess on the deforestation side, there are much bigger culprits, aren't there, in terms of other sectors? You know, if it is 130,000 hectares in 20 years, that's not a lot compared with beef, oil palm, and some of the other kind of classic villains of deforestation in the public eye. So I suppose that relative impact compared to other sectors might be one reason. But you know, in all the conferences we've been running on this for 10 years, I don't think we've ever had a pure play coffee company come to us and say, we want to come and talk about deforestation, right? Which we've had for most other sectors. So that says something, doesn't it, to a certain degree. Liesl, multi-stakeholder initiatives, how have you seen them create change in other sectors? I think the barometer points out that companies refer to their engagement in coffee through MSIs. Perhaps MSIs, you can always argue they need to raise their game. So how have they delivered change in other sectors, particularly where you've worked? I mean, I guess, would you classify Textile Exchange as an MSI, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, you know, I haven't got the definition of an MSI at my fingertips, but I think you're right. They can look quite different. I think, you know, the pure MSIs are going to involve, you know, local governments and local communities and what have you, right through, so sort of almost place-based situations through to supply chain or sector-based. But I think the point being is that as a way of bringing a group of like-minded people together, hopefully with different experiences and that diversity, then an MSI can be a safe place for that, hopefully sort of pre-competitive, trust building, solution finding, you know, let's look at ourselves in a relatively safe space and see what's going on and where our common ground is, where we need to get to and how we're going to get there. So I think in that respect, you know, a group of a community, a network of companies and organizations is brilliant and has brought various commodities or sectors or countries a long way into that more collective space. But back to the point that sort of Niels was making before, I think, you know, anonymity and competitive advantage has driven a lot of the I mean, a lot of the success, you can say, of various components of an MSI. So looking at where power bases lie, looking at how to distribute that. I mean, Vera and Andrea spoke really eloquently about the need for different voices and taking that, you know, right into driving and steering the direction of change. So I think on a positive side, MSIs can really be that pre-competitive space. You can get scale, you can get hopefully speed in doing good things, but then on the kind of the risky, more kind of concerning side, it could become a safe haven without really the kind of the nudge to really push further and change a system, but to really kind of, you know, self-reinforce a pace of travel. And so I think there's an exciting opportunity to go to the next level of what an MSI can do, or what a network of companies can do. And I think we've all mentioned, you know, Sjoerd mentioned it right at the start, you know, addressing price, addressing value share through any market is going to be absolutely imperative to get the investment and change that we need. I don't think we can avoid it anymore or put it down to, you know, farmers have got to be more productive. You know, we've really got to rethink that. And you mentioned regenerative agriculture and thinking about that holistically, Toby. You know, hopefully there's some common ground and some new opportunities here.
Yeah, I mean, it's common ground, isn't it, that allows MSIs to achieve something.
Yeah.
Help run something called the Sustainable Wine Roundtable. We've got 10 retailers to commit to reduce bottle weight by 22% by the end of 2026 for billions of bottles, because that's a common thing they can all agree on, and it's a good start.
Yeah, you just raised a very good point. Just very quickly, is having clear, articulated accountability, you know, setting those targets, agreeing on them, and a pathway to get there. That's, you know, there's definitely all the soft side and well, not so soft, of course, but getting those hard timelines and accountability in is key to the success of an MSI.
I'm no coffee expert, but I want to see what you think about this, Liesl, as a sort of outside of the coffee industry. I think if the coffee industry really wants to raise its game, the one thing I'm sure they all can agree on is the need to urgently define and drive regen ag, as we've mentioned, in coffee. And we've seen how Nestle, who are one of the leaders in this index and the barometer, are trying to do that. Do you think that's the win opportunity that the coffee industry, if they want to take notice of this and say, right, we've got to raise our game, it strikes me that regen ag collectively is something they could be able to agree on and start implementing at a faster pace. What do you think?
Yes, you know, on a more cynical level, you know, we're relabeling things from sustainable to regen, but I don't believe that. I'm just saying there is that risk of sort of diversion and conversation but in saying that, I think there's definitely a positive opportunity. Sorry, I don't know why that's ringing. To, well, like you say, find that common ground, and to some extent, you know, redo the wrongs. I mean, I think we're in this big loss and damage. You know, we have to compensate for the damage that's been done and find really innovative ways to do that. And I do think regenerative agriculture, as a topic, as a conversation, regenerative everything is really about preserving, conserving, and sort of undoing some of the damage that we thought we were doing the right things, right? The Green Revolution, you know, it's an old story, but, you know, we thought we were doing the right things. We're building productivity. And it's not to say we didn't get a lot of gain from that, but it's really now about what are the lessons learned? What can we do differently? It's not necessarily about going back to before. In fact, it's not about that, but it's really recognizing some of those stakeholders, practices, traditions that we neglected, passed over, you know, with some of the, you know, modern agriculture kind of thinking. So yeah, regen, agree with you to that extent.
Right. I'm stealing about a minute extra to ask Niels. Do you agree? I mean, CI, you know, you guys do a lot in this space. Is regen the kind of next sort of pivot to get the industry? Maybe pivot's not the right word, but is it the thing that could really get the industry agreeing on a common approach to raising the game? What do you think, Niels? Briefly.
I would say I fully agree with Liesl in terms of I wouldn't get stuck on trying to define universal truth on Regen Act and then roll it out in all these coffee producing countries. So also to Andrea's earlier point, like recognizing the differences there are, I think it's about moving towards actions, finding local solutions by taking that landscape approach that you alluded to, Toby. So how can we scale investments into climate and nature to ensure prosperity for the local coffee producing communities?
Okay, and a quick question before we move into our next session, which everyone will be in, but roasters, the new Coffee Brew Index is ranking them. Why? What's the intention here? Tell us more.
Sure. So I think for many years, we've been trying to capture quantitative progress on coffee sustainability through counting certified beans. And through the Coffee Barometer, we're still doing that. We also have known for quite a while that this is only one indicator to track progress. I think throughout the sector, we've seen several efforts that push for more transparency and accountability to understand what corporate efforts in the sector are and how much progress there is. And I think the novelty and the niche of the index is looking at more depth into the maturity and presence of policies and strategies at the corporate level, and more transparency on those policies, like who is doing what kind of policies, do you have these elements and those elements in place, how strong is your deforestation commitment, is your climate target aligned with SBTi, and so on and so forth. I think that is going to absolutely drive that joint learning and peer learning in the industry, to get faster toward those investments on the ground. So when we know that companies all have time-bound and measurable commitments and track progress over time on those, so that disclosure component is super key, then we all know where risks are. Everyone will need to conduct their risk assessments. We can also do that more jointly. And then once we understand, okay, this is a landscape where we see a lot of deforestation or risk of deforestation, how do we not cut and run, turn our backs to those communities, but actually mitigate by investing in those places, supporting those communities to make sure that companies comply and communities continue to produce coffee.
Thank you, Niels. Well, let's talk about innovation and opportunity now. I can see that of our 321 participants, most seem to have stayed with us. So let's keep them here by making it more interesting. So we're going to bring back our speakers from earlier. And my first question to you three is, would you care to reflect on what you've just heard from Niels and from Liesl? Sjoerd, why don't I come to you first? We know there's no magic bullet to anything. There's no single solution. I think it was a philosopher who said, for every complex problem, there is a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong, which is a quote I always enjoy. H.L. Mencken, I think, said that. So if regen is not a magic bullet, what can it do for us in a more unified way? What are your thoughts, Sjoerd, on what you've heard?
No, I think the philosopher is right. We over the years, we believed in many so-called solutions, and are still it seems difficult to really make progress. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of learnings in the coffee sector, but also broader in the different agricultural tropical commodities that actually indicate that we can improve the situation at the production level in various ways. But I think it's also important to point out that we keep on falling into the same trap also as a sector, to keep on discussing what should be done at farm level. Because at the same time, we really need to turn around the discussion and also start discussing, okay, what are actually the changes that are necessary in the trade system itself to really enable farmers to invest themselves in their farms and to really create a thriving livelihood, keeping or addressing all kind of livelihood issues, but also taking care of the environment. And if the trade system as such is not enabling this, then we can discuss for a long time regenerative agriculture or turning the sector into beautiful agroforestry systems and blah, blah, blah. But then still the conclusion will be, well, no one is actually able to make a living out of it. And in that way, it's sort of dead end street. So I would say we need to really broaden the discussion. Yes, we need to think about, okay, what do we know? What do we have to know? Where do we need more research to really turn the sector onto the right track? At the same time, we need to really be aware that we need to enable all these good ideas and trajectories and put the money where our mouth is. So,
okay, I'm going to turn to Andrea and Vera in a minute. One quick follow-up question for you, as the author of the barometer. Anthony Fountain. Hi, Anthony. Nice to hear from you. Good to see you. Well, on here anyway. He points out we're being too friendly to companies. I know Anthony likes to have a bit of edge to the work that he does, and good work it is too. So let's just talk about one of the companies, Kraft Heinz, which seems to score pretty much bottom in all of your assessments. Is this about transparency and disclosure by them, or about performance? Because I've seen these rankings over the years, and you see companies saying, well, they just didn't, these naive NGOs and their researchers, they just didn't know how great we were. And they didn't know because we haven't told them, because we're so humble, we don't, or we haven't got organized to publish it yet. So how much of your assessment of a company like that do you think is a matter of disclosure versus performance?
Well, let's first say the good thing is we got into contact with Kraft Heinz, but only last week. I think that also underlines a bit, the going back and forth with doing this work and trying to get the information that we need from companies to actually make sense of it. We've seen this with almost all the companies in our list, and of course we have been working with most of them for the last 10 years. And as soon as you really start publishing your materials, then somehow companies tend to wake up and see, oh, I need to be part of this discussion, and I need to give my insights. But what we also see is, and sticking to the example of Kraft Heinz, we also have an overview of the companies participating in different multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's Kraft Heinz and Smuckers that are not active in any of these initiatives. So if we are not able to find them or encounter them, it's going to be very hard to have an open discussion around sustainability, transparency, etc. But we, and maybe to the comment of Anthony about friendliness, yes, we try to be in a conversation mode with these companies, and it's also our intention to actually improve the level of information to have that important discussion around sustainability. I don't know in the end if all of them find our findings so friendly, but that's something for later discussion.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, anything you want to say on that theme?
On friendliness, we try to be friendly. Perhaps a comment that is not that friendly is that everything on paper is perfect, right? So we're doing an assessment on paper based on public available information. We have to then look at if all those that are very able to produce beautiful reports are actually delivering that change we want them to see. So I think this is an important thing. It is somehow a secondary review that we do based on public information. So this will be such a better version of this index will be, can we actually see if the companies are able to report this change that they say that they're delivering, and how to do that. And I think a second point regarding regenerative agriculture and how do we move from just actions in the field and then perhaps look at the other side of the supply chain. Both are needed, I think. And that's what we have to do. And I agree with Sjoerd that there's quite a lot of focus on the field, and we like focus on the field. And Solidaridad, this is quite a lot of the things that we do when we work on climate smart agriculture and how does that link to regenerative agriculture and so on and so forth. But I also think that until a certain extent, we have to move from discussion to action. And I think that's what we struggle in the coffee sector to do. We're good at discussing, and then what do we do next? And I do believe that in the other part of the supply chain, when we look at trading practices, there are things that can be done practically and that can change overnight. So for instance, in terms of payment, 10 years ago, you were able to pay producers in a relatively short period of time, 30 days of payment after delivery of the coffee. Now the practice has changed to 90, 180, 360. That puts a dramatic pressure on producers. And this is something that changed really quickly and can be changed back. So we have all those things that we need action to do. And it's not just about looking practices in the field, it's also about looking trading practices. And I think one of the challenges that I see that could be resolved as well is that we quite often have these objectives that are developed by sustainability teams, but they're not necessarily working very closely with the sourcing teams. And I think this is something that could be improved. And those practices could change overnight because they changed 10 years ago very rapidly. Why can't we not change it back? So both things are important, but certainly moving from discussion to action. I understand that we have to have a broader discussion and move from that, but the coffee sector, we kind of get stuck on the discussion and struggle with the other part.
Thank you. So I'm going through the questions here in the chat. There's some really interesting comments. Much of it is things that sort of came in while we were talking about them. So well done, team, because you've actually addressed a lot of the questions while you were talking. But to the earlier point about brevity, anonymous attendee, thank you, anonymous attendee, has kind of summed it all up for me in one sentence with a question I'm going to put to all of you now. And you can't cite the same examples, right? And Liesl, you can talk about non-coffee because it's unfair to ask you about coffee. The question is, can you share examples of coffee supply chains that are real examples to follow and scalable? And I think what the reference there is, sustainability success. So I'm going to put you all on the spot here. You're going to have to come up with an example right now, or risk looking slightly silly on your own webinar. And I'm going to ask Liesl to talk about it from a non-coffee point of view. I think if we are going to take this forward, particularly for company execs watching this, we've got to find examples that they can look to. So while the rest of you are thinking about this, I'm going to come to Andrea first, because you're Solidaridad, you've got examples. Come on, so it's easy. Go ahead.
A good example, I think something that we have done, I just come back to our climate smart agriculture model. I think that works and is a good example to be at scale, because we started by what Vera was saying at the beginning. We started just by saying, does this work in the farm, and forget about the rest? And can this protect and maintain productivity and protect producers' income? And this was a question that we had back in 2012. And we did it with about 3,000 producers. And now we have been able to scale it to about 20,000 producers. And we're working with important partners and roasters that are possibly in this webinar. So I think that's a good example that could take that point that Vera said at the beginning of, what is needed at producer level. Forget about the market, because the market is always going to be imperfect. But then how can we start to move that forward, not just to produce coffee that is deforestation free, that has good practices in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but also how can we start to work with partners, trading partners, for them to source this coffee, and how can we start to work with the roasters on it, and how can we move? It's not a perfect simple system at all, and it has to be very specific depending on what it is. Climate smart, which is very similar to regenerative agriculture, and it comes back to the definition. What does that mean in Brazil, in Colombia, in East Africa? We have different models, but I think that this is a good thing that I would like to highlight, because we have been able to scale it up. Not perfect, but I think good enough.
Okay, so for the 20,000 farmers, what is it that you've scaled from the pilot?
So the question was, can they increase productivity or maintaining by reducing carbon emissions and by stopping deforestation? And the answer was yes. And we did this before we engaged with the market. And then with the market, we have been able to scale it up.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting and, you know, inspiring. So thank you. Vera, is your example going to be Azahar coffee? And it's okay if it is.
And I really wanted to find another one, which is because I do think that there are several out there that are showing great examples. I do want to take the economic relevance into this conversation when achieving certain intervention solution for even environmental issues. And that for me, the part and the piece that I want to showcase here is that by using a guide that we have produced, which is called the Sustainable Coffee Buyers Guide, it can be found at coffeebuyers.org, you can actually know what that price is, taking into consideration cost of production, plus margin and certain income goals. And when we started to use that particular tool in order to define these, these sourcing options that we have, we actually are now engaging with roasters into supply chain solutions on a long-term scale. Because at the end of the day, we know what kind of price we're providing covers that cost of production plus margin, as well as having an income goal set in mind for that. Okay, so I do think that the relevance of that economic part is very much important.
Okay, so Solidarida's example is proving there isn't a link between sort of tackling negative things and productivity. Your information you mentioned, Vera, is on, you said coffeebuyers.org, is that right? That's where people go to look at it. Great, thank you. Yes. Niels, is your example going to be Starbucks? I'm trying to predict here. Tell us.
All switching hats. I'll take another example. Actually, through the work that we're leading as Conservation International on the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, which is one of the multiple multi-stakeholder initiatives in the coffee sector. We're about to kick off a fairly large-scale study looking at carbon footprint baselines in Latin America. So in setting climate targets, companies are struggling to find the primary data to actually know what their footprint is. So relying on outdated databases, secondary databases. So to get very reliable data on their footprints, we're starting a study with actually 7 out of the 10 companies that are in the index. So that is encouraging to see. And based on having more kind of alignment on methodology on how are we measuring a carbon footprint and having more reliable data on what are some of the baselines, we can also more easily get to investments on the ground, taking a landscape approach. So for instance, we've prioritized the Huila in Colombia, for instance, where we're bringing together public and private sector and put them around the table to define goals for that landscape, and not only as Conservation International with one of our corporate partners, and for instance, Starbucks or others, but also with other NGOs like IDH working in this region. So really putting together civil society, public sector, private sector that have a common interest in a specific place, and communities, of course, to define local goals, to address local challenges, and connect that to the global agenda in terms of meeting climate targets, meeting the Paris Agreement, meeting the global biodiversity framework targets.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Sjoerd, let me turn to you before Liesl gives us a non-coffee example. If I can ask you both to be fairly brief, because time is a factor here. Go ahead.
Sure. One that came to my mind, it's already a bit older. Project we once did with Ecom and Sucafina was actually looking especially at the issue of scale, and we reached around 100,000 farmers in Uganda and Kenya with a program that was combining the diversification of income, access to renewable energy, gender equality, adaptation to climate change, so a whole broad spectrum which was quite successful. But what's also one of the issues with a lot of these programs is that they tend to have this communist planning trajectories of 5 years, and then donors and companies want to do something different. And I think that is what we also need to bring in our commitments to the sector, is this long-term views and support structures. So yes,
okay.
It's possible, but it's also something for long-term involvement.
Okay, I see there are some suggestions made in the chat as well of other examples. So thank you all for those. We'll try and capture those. Liesl, before we move on to our poll question, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a few actually, and I was kind of surprised to think how many did come to mind in the textiles sort of sector, despite all the challenges. But I think I'll use the one that connects to Solidaridad, because I think it's a nice synergy here, and that is an agroecology based cooperative in India, in Odisha, called Chetna. And I think Andrea, it started out more, to call it a social experiment, I think, it undermines the value and power of what this cooperative was focused on doing. But it really was getting into seed sovereignty, into sort of farmer leadership, women trainers, pushing gender issues in very kind of rural conservative settings to bring about that kind of self-sufficiency and change, and farmer-centered outcomes. And then layered into that a few years later was a sort of a demand alliance called Chetco, which is a group of small-scale retailers, fashion retailers, that once again, a bit of a social experiment, tried to connect the way they valued, paid, priced the social environmental deliverables alongside the actual commodity. Now, I think this was a really hard task given the economic landscape that we're operating in, basically commodity driven. But I think there's so much that we could learn from organizations like this as we go forward. I'll refrain from saying more because I know we're short of time.
Thank you, Liesl. Very interesting. Well, we've got another minute or so to reflect on some of those responses while we put up our poll question. So this is to take the temperature of the audience. Let's see what you think about it. It strikes me that sort of C and D here are sort of the same. So we might bundle those together as responses. But if you can vote on that now, please. The panelists can't vote. You are disenfranchised, I'm afraid, from this, but I'm sure you'll manage. Your other rights are respected. And the example I would throw into the mix while we're waiting for everyone to vote for the next 45 to 60 seconds, the example I was going to use, Liesl, and perhaps you could tell us if you agree from outside coffee, I love the work that Cotton Connect does. And I think they're a great example of a company that's a social enterprise. And they sound like they're sort of cute and small and sort of, little fair trade, expensive handbag kind of thing, but not at all. They've actually got some real scale with tens of thousands of farmers benefiting from being moved into kind of degrees of sustainability. And now they're moving them towards regen from a sustainability code to a regen code. And I think they're a really interesting example of perhaps what might be done in coffee, considering I think all their work is with smallholders. So Liesl, I saw you give a thumbs up, so I guess you agree with that as an example.
Oh, absolutely. And so much social context within the work that they do, which is, it's got to all be at the end of the day about ownership and permanence. And we didn't talk about resilience, but that's with climate change and the rest, that's got to be at the heart, or we're going to lose our supply bases. So yeah,
one of my favorite examples from their work is going to farmers and saying, have you seen how much honey sells for? And the farmers say, yeah, we can't afford it. It costs a fortune. They say, well, if you just plant some wildflowers over here next to your fields, then maybe we can put a little beehive in, see what happens. And then suddenly 6 months or a year later, these farmers have they can double their income by selling honey. Because they've got the land, they just didn't have the help to utilize it properly. And the other example I particularly love is swiftlet nesting boxes in Indonesia, where Chinese bird's nest super traders turn up and pay $1,000 a kilo to these villagers for the bird's nests, and no animals are harmed. And some people have to eat bird's nest soup, I suppose, and the villagers make a fortune. So I always like these examples to show us what can be done on a local level to enhance farmers' incomes. So back to our poll. Well, I think it's pretty clear, isn't it? Should we include additional roasters and traders? Yes, bring them all in. I think we probably all predicted that that's how the audience might vote on this, but always good for our friends here at the Barometer to have some validation, because I suspect you asked that poll question because that's what you wanted to do anyway. So now you have official validation of at least more than 100 stakeholders agreeing with that. So there we go. That's the poll done. Well, in terms of closing remarks, we haven't been able to get through all of the questions in the Q&A. We'll try and capture that in some way. And I think this should be seen as the start of a conversation. And I would encourage you to get in touch with those involved in the Barometer. And I think we've posted a way to do that in the chat. I'm sure many of you will continue the conversation. We look forward to working with Solidaridad and CI and Ethos again on this. And of course, through Innovation Forum, we are talking about coffee as often as we can. And if you want to learn about other commodities, of course, Solidaridad and CI work on those as well. So if we can assist in any way to those on the webinar in breaking out of a silo and learning from other commodities, we're happy to do that. In the meantime, I'd really like to thank all of our panelists for putting up with some tough questions from the audience, and I tried to throw in a few myself. So Sjoerd, thank you. Vera, Andrea, Niels, and Liesl, thank you all so much for joining us, offering your insights, and thanks so much to the audience for showing up. Looking forward to hearing your feedback, and you'll be hearing from us soon. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks,
Thank
Toby.
you so much.
Thanks, everyone.